On May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, France, a 19-year-old peasant girl prepared to face one of the most horrifying deaths in medieval history. What happened that day shocked even battle-hardened soldiers who witnessed the execution, and the deliberate cruelty of her death would haunt Europe's collective memory for centuries. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, had risen from farmer's daughter to military commander, altering the course of the Hundred Years' War. But as she stood bound to a 4-meter-high stake, surrounded by 5,000 jeering spectators, she was no longer the triumphant warrior who had lifted the siege of Orleans. She was a condemned heretic, facing a death engineered for maximum suffering. The executioner, Geoffrey Thurage, received specific instructions that deviated from standard practice. The unusually tall structure eliminated the possibility of merciful strangulation, ensuring that Joan would be burned alive and fully conscious. This calculated decision by her English captors made the execution as public and brutal as possible. What followed was so horrifying that even seasoned soldiers later called it one of the most dreadful sights they had ever seen. The young woman who claimed to hear the voices of saints spent her final moments crying out the name of Jesus. Her screams echoed across the square for more than 10 minutes of unbearable agony. The execution was the culmination of a meticulously orchestrated campaign of betrayal, political manipulation, and judicial corruption involving kings, nobles, and high-ranking church officials. Joan's death reveals the darkest corners of medieval politics and the length powerful men were willing to go to silence a young woman who dared challenge their authority. Her path to this horrific end began with cold calculation in a nobleman's accounting chamber, where Joan's life was literally sold to the highest bidder, 100,000 livres. This betrayal exposed the brutal reality of medieval warfare and how even celebrated heroes became expendable when political necessity demanded their sacrifice. To grasp the full horror of what happened in Rouen, one must first understand Joan's extraordinary rise and the reasons her death was deemed necessary by those who orchestrated it. Her story is one of courage and the faith of insurmountable odds, but also a harsh reminder of how swiftly power turns against those who threaten its interests. The execution was not merely punishment. It was a message, broadcast to 5,000 witnesses and intended to reverberate across France and beyond. Yet the message that ultimately emerged was something else entirely, transforming her death into the foundation of a legend that outlived all who sought to destroy her. The year 1431 found France in a state of unprecedented chaos. The French sub-year had raged for nearly a century, turning a once prosperous kingdom into a battlefield where English and French forces carved up territory with little regard for the suffering of ordinary people. The French monarchy was in crisis, with competing claims and shifting alliances. Into this chaos stepped Joan of Arc, a teenager from Daumary, France, who claimed to receive divine visions from Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. These messengers, she said, instructed her to drive the English from French soil and ensure the coronation of the Dauphin Charles as the rightful king of France. Amazingly, she succeeded in convincing the court to grant her military command. The Siege of Orleans in 1429 made Joan a name known across Europe. The city had endured months of English blockade, its population slowly starving and its defenses crumbling. Joan's arrival with reinforcements changed everything, not just militarily, but in the morale of the defenders. Within days, the siege was lifted, and Joan's reputation as divinely inspired was cemented. Her campaigns reversed years of French defeats, and cities under English control for decades opened their gates at the mere mention of her name. French nobles who had collaborated with the English suddenly rediscovered patriotism. Most importantly, Dauphin Charles was crowned King Charles VII in Reims Cathedral, with Joan beside him, legitimizing his claim. But a success in medieval warfare was always fleeting, and Joan's victories bred powerful enemies. The English, who had invested decades and vast resources in conquering France, saw her as an existential threat. The Burgundians, French nobles allied with England for political gain, viewed her as a dangerous upstart whose popular appeal threatened the established order. Even within the French court, Joan's influence aroused suspicion among nobles irritated by having to obey a peasant girl. Her direct access to the king and growing legend threatened the traditional hierarchy. The very qualities that made her effective, confidence, uncompromising resolve, appeals to divine authority, turned Joan into a threat to men whose power relied on political flexibility. The church harbored conflicted feelings about her claims. Though Joan's victories suggested divine favor, her assertion of direct communication with saints bypassed ecclesiastical hierarchy, causing deep unease. The idea that God could speak through an illiterate peasant girl rather than the ordained clergy challenged the foundations of religious authority. It was the convergence of political, military, and religious resistance that sealed her fate. Her enemies understood. As long as she remained free, she would inspire French resistance and undermine English occupation. They realized her death had to be public and final, not merely the removal of a threat, but the destruction of a legend. The trap was laid during the siege of Compiègne in May 1430. A strategically vital city, Compiègne remained loyal to Charles VII, despite being surrounded by Burgundian territories. When the Burgundians began their siege, Joan rode to its aid with a small force, believing she could repeat past successes through boldness and divine intervention. But political calculations had shifted. Her value as a bargaining chip now outweighed her military significance, even to allies. The betrayal that determined her fate came from those who saw her not as the Maid of Orleans, but as a commodity to be sold. Joan's capture on May 23, 1430, during a skirmish outside Compiègne, was a deliberate act of treachery. While attacking Burgundian positions, she found herself cut off when the city gates suddenly closed behind her. What appeared to be a tactical error was in fact the result of secret negotiations that had been underway for weeks. Guillaume de Flavy, captain of Compiègne, had been discussing surrender terms with the Burgundians. Joan's presence complicated these talks. Her reputation made capitulation politically impossible while she remained free. By isolating her during a supposedly routine sortie, de Flavy could claim loyalty while ensuring she fell into enemy hands. Jean of Luxembourg, commanding the Burgundian troops who captured Joan, immediately recognized the extraordinary financial opportunity before him. The English had made it clear they were willing to pay handsomely for her imprisonment, though other parties might also bid. The negotiations following her capture exposed the brutal reality of medieval politics. King Charles VII, whom Joan had personally crowned, made no serious effort to secure her release. The perpetually depleted royal treasury could not compete with English offers. Moreover, Charles and his advisors concluded that Joan was more useful as a martyr than as a living commander. The political logic was coldly pragmatic. Her early victories had legitimized Charles's throne and inspired the French, but her continued presence hindered his ability to negotiate from a position of strength rather than divine dependence. Her death, if properly managed, could serve France's interest, becoming a potent symbol of English cruelty and removing a potentially inconvenient military figure. The English were determined to obtain Joan at any cost, knowing that executing a prisoner of war would create martyrdom and strengthen French resistance. Instead, they needed to destroy her reputation, proving that her victories were the work of demonic forces rather than divine guidance. This required a complex legal and propaganda campaign to discredit her claims and justify execution as a religious necessity. The agreed price was 100,000 livres, equivalent to several $1 million today. Jean de Luxembourg's decision was purely financial, though cloaked in legal rhetoric about Joan's crimes against Christianity. The deal was finalized in January 1431, and Joan was handed over to the English like a valuable possession passed from hand to hand. What appeared to be a carefully organized ecclesiastical trial was, in reality, a theatrical performance designed to provide religious justification for a political execution. Legal proceedings began in February 1431 under the direction of Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais.
Kachan was no impartial judge, but a political appointee whose loyalty to England was absolute. Expelled from his diocese by French forces, he had spent years in English-held territory, earning his living by serving English interests in various roles. The composition of the tribunal clearly revealed the predetermined nature of the process. Of the 42 appointed judges, nearly all owed their positions to English patronage. Many were academics from the University of Paris, aligned with the pro-English faction. The rest were clergy from English-controlled territories, fully aware that their advancement depended on delivering the desired verdict. Joan's legal situation was hopeless from the outset. She was denied legal counsel, despite canon law requiring that the accused be provided with an advocate. She was forced to appear before 42 learned men speaking Latin, which she barely understood, without any guidance on the legal consequences of her answers. When she requested that loyal French priests be included among the judges, the request was rejected as impossible due to the ongoing war. The charges against Joan were a carefully crafted blend of genuine theological questions and political propaganda aimed at justifying her execution. The main accusations concerned her claims of divine revelation, her wearing of male clothing, and her refusal to submit to ecclesiastical military authority. Each of these could result in a death sentence if the judges chose to interpret them as heresy rather than error. The interrogations that followed were a form of psychological torture, designed to break Joan's spirit and force her to recant. She was questioned for hours each day, with judges frequently rotated to maintain constant pressure. The questions were deliberately repetitive and confusing, intended to catch her in contradictions or elicit statements that could be interpreted as heretical. Throughout this ordeal, Joan remained chained in a cell guarded by English soldiers who constantly harassed her. Despite the immense pressure, her responses displayed sharp intellect and unwavering faith, which irritated her interrogators. When asked about the voices, she consistently affirmed they came from God and instructed her to save France. On the matter of male clothing, she explained it was a practical necessity for military life and personal safety in prison. When urged to submit to church authority, she insisted she already submitted to God, the highest source of legitimate ecclesiastical power. The most painful moments came during discussions of specific military actions and political decisions. The judges were particularly interested in her role in sieges and her interactions with King Charles VII, as they sought to portray her not as a divinely inspired warrior, but as a bloodthirsty adventurer exploiting religious sentiment for personal gain. These accusations clearly caused Joan distress, striking at her understanding of her divine mission. As the weeks passed, Joan refused to recant or submit to the tribunal's authority as they demanded. This created difficulties for Kachan and his allies, who needed at least the appearance of lawful repentance to justify the predetermined sentence. Their solution was psychological manipulation, false promises, and outright deception, culminating in the trial's most controversial moment. The physical and psychological pressure applied in spring of 1431 was aimed at breaking Joan's spirit without leaving evidence that could discredit the legal procedure. English guards maintained constant surveillance, depriving her of sleep and subjecting her to relentless verbal abuse and sexual threats. Heavy chains caused continuous pain, weakening her physically and emotionally. Joan's cell was deliberately designed for maximum psychological stress. Located in the tower of Rowan Castle, it was cold, damp, and poorly lit, with a single small window allowing minimal daylight. Thick walls muffled sound, creating total isolation. Guards were frequently rotated to prevent any sympathy from developing between Joan and her captors. Food became another tool of control. She received just enough to remain alive and alert for interrogations, but not enough to maintain physical strength. Meals were intentionally unpalatable and served irregularly to disrupt her sense of time and routine. Water was sometimes withheld for hours to increase discomfort during questioning. The interrogation methods were sophisticated for their time, exploiting her peasant background and limited education. Questions were phrased in complex theological language she struggled to understand. Her confusion was then interpreted as evidence of demonic influence.
When Joan gave clear, logical answers, they were interpreted as evidence of supernatural guidance. The judges employed circular questioning, deliberately designed to trap her in contradictions. The same questions were asked repeatedly with slight variations, hoping to uncover inconsistencies that could be construed as deceit. When Joan recognized these tactics and refused to answer repetitive questions, her refusal was portrayed as stubbornness and a sign of heretical nature. Sexual humiliation became another tool of suppression. Her male clothing, which she wore for protection against assault, was confiscated and replaced with female garments, making her more vulnerable to the guards. When she was forced to change clothes in front of them, her protests were dismissed as false modesty. The constant threat of sexual violence maintained psychological pressure without leaving physical marks. Sophisticated psychological manipulation involved false hope and artificially induced despair. Joan was alternately told that powerful allies were working for her release and that she had been completely abandoned by former supporters. These emotional swings eroded her psychological defenses, making her more susceptible to suggestions to confess and beg the court for mercy. Medical care was deliberately withheld when Joan fell ill due to the conditions of her imprisonment. When she developed a life-threatening fever, she was given just enough treatment to survive until execution, but not enough to recover. This calculated cruelty weakened her resistance while ensuring she remained mentally capable of participating in her final condemnation. By May 1431, these measures had achieved their intended effect. Joan was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and psychologically isolated to the point that rational decision-making became nearly impossible. The judges had created ideal conditions for extracting a confession necessary to justify her execution while maintaining the appearance of a lawful trial. On May 24, 1431, Joan was brought to the cemetery of the Abbey of St. Ouen, where, according to the judges, she was offered a final chance to admit her errors and reconcile with the church. A large crowd had gathered, expecting either Joan's recantation or her immediate execution. The scene was carefully staged to heighten psychological pressure and public humiliation while projecting an image of merciful justice. The ceremony began with a lengthy sermon by Guillaume Erard, a renowned theologian chosen for his ability to convincingly denounce Joan's actions before the crowd. Erard's speech was a masterpiece of medieval rhetoric, blending complex theological arguments with emotional appeals aimed at turning the crowd against Joan, portraying her not as a misguided girl, but as a dangerous heretic whose influence had led thousands astray. The climax of the sermon was a direct appeal to Joan, demanding that she publicly renounce her claims of divine inspiration and submit to church authority. The crowd fell silent, all eyes fixed on the 19-year-old prisoner in chains, standing before a platform filled with learned judges and powerful nobles. The moment underscored her isolation and helplessness while offering a final chance to save her life through complete submission. Joan's initial response was defiant. She declared that her voices came from God and that she could not deny the truth merely to save her life. This statement caused an immediate uproar, with many calling for her immediate execution as an unrepentant heretic. The judges exchanged meaningful glances. Joan's refusal gave them the legal basis for the already decided death sentence. But then something unexpected happened. As the crowd's hostility peaked and the executioner prepared for immediate burning, Joan suddenly broke down. Whether from physical exhaustion, psychological pressure, or genuine terror at her impending death, she began to cry and declared her willingness to submit to church authority. This apparent collapse was exactly what the judges had been working toward for months. What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance aimed at securing a public confession while preserving the option to later execute Joan as a relapsed heretic. A document of abjuration was quickly prepared, allegedly containing an admission of error and a renunciation of her previous claims. The document was read aloud in Latin, which Joan did not understand, and she was told that signing it would save her life and lead to her transfer to a church present under more humane conditions.
Joan's decision to sign the abjuration was a result of psychological manipulation, physical exhaustion, and false promises the judges never intended to keep. She was told that her confession would result in life imprisonment rather than death, and that she would be moved to a church prison guarded by women instead of English soldiers. It was a lie, but Joan could not have known that when she marked the documents she could not read. The crowd's reaction to her apparent recantation was mixed. Some were disappointed they would not witness an immediate execution. Others were moved by what appeared to be sincere repentance. The judges declared that Joan's confession demonstrated the church's mercy and its willingness to forgive grave errors when acknowledged with proper humility. Behind the satisfied expressions lay the understanding that this apparent mercy was merely the first act of a drama ending in Joan's death. The promised transfer to ecclesiastical custody never happened. Instead, Joan was returned to the same cell, the same chains, and the same English guards who had tormented her throughout her imprisonment. The only change was the requirement to wear female clothing as a sign of submission to church authority. This demand soon gave the judges a pretext for final condemnation. The trap leading to Joan's execution had been flawlessly constructed. Her supposed confession gave the judges legal cover, leaving her in a position where any return to her previous claims could be interpreted as heretical relapse. The death sentence her enemies had always sought was now only days away, with no chance of escape or pardon. Joan's return to her cell after the abjuration marked the beginning of the final phase of her persecution. The English guards, temporarily restrained during public proceedings, now felt free to intensify harassment and abuse. They focused especially on forcing her to abandon male clothing, one of the central accusations, seeing it as a chance to humiliate her further and create grounds for new charges of heresy. The issue of clothing was more complex than it seemed. Joan had originally chosen male attire for practical reasons during military campaigns, but it had also become a symbol of her rejection of traditional gender roles and her assertion of divine calling. The judges understood that forcing her into female clothing would be both a practical humiliation and a symbolic victory. Yet they also knew that her return to male clothing could provide the legal basis needed for execution. The psychological manipulation surrounding her clothing was sophisticated and cruel. Joan was told that her salvation depended on accepting female clothing as a sign of submission to church authority. At the same time, guards were instructed to create conditions that made wearing female clothing dangerous. The threat of sexual violence became constant and explicit, forcing Joan to choose between spiritual submission and physical safety. For several days, Joan tried to comply with the demand imposed by her confession. She wore the female garments provided by the guards and refrained from speaking about her divine mission. But the conditions of her imprisonment made this increasingly difficult. The guards' behavior grew more aggressive, and Joan was forced to acknowledge that the promised improvement in treatment had been a lie designed to extract her confession. The critical moment came on May 27, when Joan was found wearing male clothing in her cell. There are different accounts of how this happened. Some sources claim the guards deliberately left her only male clothing, removing the female garments during the night. Others believe Joan consciously chose to wear male attire again as a rejection of her coerced confession. The truth likely includes elements of both, as the guards acted under instructions aimed at creating precisely this situation. When asked about her return to male clothing, Joan initially tried to explain it as a practical necessity for protection. But under constant interrogation pressure, she began once again to speak of her voices and divine mission. This was exactly what the judges had been waiting for. Her return to her previous claims, combined with male clothing, gave them the legal grounds to declare her a heretic who had relapsed and was subject to execution. The speed with which the final procedures were carried out showed how predetermined Joan's fate had been. Within hours of her being found in male clothing, a final court was convened to officially declare her a relapsed heretic. Joan was given no opportunity to explain her actions or defend herself against the new charges. The judges had everything they needed and acted swiftly to prevent any chance of outside intervention. The official declaration of Joan's relapse was accompanied by her immediate transfer to secular authorities for execution. This transfer was a legal fiction. designed to shield the church from direct responsibility while ensuring the execution proceeded without delay. The secular authorities, represented by English military commanders, were more than willing to carry out the sentence, perfectly aligned with their political interests.
The execution date was set for May 30th, 1431, just 3 days after Joan once again donned male clothing. Such a swift resolution left no room for appeals, intervention, or a change of heart that might derail the outcome her enemies had so relentlessly pursued. Preparations for her death had already begun, and everything was arranged to intensify her suffering and create maximum public impact. Joan's sentence had barely been pronounced when English military commanders began close coordination with church authorities to ensure the execution served both immediate political goals and long-term propaganda objectives. Every detail was calculated to exert psychological pressure on the French population and on potential future rebels who might be inspired by Joan's example. Rouen old marketplace was chosen because it could accommodate the expected crowd and was located in the heart of English-controlled territory. This guaranteed that Joan's supporters could not rescue her, and the assembled audience was largely sympathetic to the English side. The square also carried symbolic weight as a place of commerce, suggesting that Joan's death was a kind of transaction for political stability. Construction of the scaffold was overseen by experienced executioners who knew how to stage a burning that would be both a spectacle and a torment. A 4-meter-high stake was erected specifically to eliminate the traditional practice of strangling condemned heretics before ignition. This deviation from standard procedure was designed to ensure Joan would burn alive and fully conscious, creating a more dramatic and terrifying display. The materials for the execution were also carefully selected. The wood was raw and green, meant to burn slowly and produce thick smoke. This prolonged Joan's agony and ensured visibility of the execution from a great distance. A cloak soaked with sulfur, which Joan was to wear, accelerated burning in the upper body and released toxic fumes, intensifying her suffering. The execution was scheduled for mid-morning to ensure maximum attendance and visibility. Bells throughout the city were to ring continuously from dawn until the execution's end so that no one in Rouen could claim ignorance. Town criers walked the streets announcing the time and place, with special measures taken to accommodate the expected crowd. Security measures were extensive. English soldiers occupied the entire marketplace and surrounding streets, ordered to prevent disturbances and arrest anyone showing sympathy for Joan. The executioner and his assistants were guarded by armed sentries to prevent any rescue attempts. Additional troops were held in reserve, ready to act at the first sign of unrest. The propaganda value of the execution was carefully planned by English officials, who understood that Joan's death had to be perceived as a triumph of justice, not political revenge. Official statements were prepared explaining that Joan's execution was necessary to protect Christendom from demonic forces. These documents were distributed throughout English-controlled territories to ensure the proper interpretation of events among all potential audiences. Church officials who had presided over Joan's trial were required to attend the execution to lend it religious legitimacy. Their presence was meant to show that Joan's death had full ecclesiastical support and was not merely a secular political act. This religious sanction was deemed essential to counter attempts to portray Joan as a martyr for the French cause. Final preparations included measures to destroy Joan's remains, so they could not become relics capable of inspiring future resistance. Her body was to be completely burned and the ashes scattered into the River Seine, leaving no physical trace. This precaution reflected the English understanding that even in death, Joan could pose a threat to their control over France. At 9 o'clock in the morning on May 30th, 1431, Joan was led from her cell for the last time. The 19-year-old girl who emerged into the light bore little resemblance to the confident commander who had lifted the siege of Orleans just 2 years earlier. Months of imprisonment, psychological torture, and physical exhaustion had left her gaunt and frail, but her guards ensured she was conscious enough to fully comprehend what was happening.
The procession to the execution site was deliberately staged as a public humiliation.
Joan was dressed in a long white shift and a cloak soaked in sulfur, which accelerated her burning and filled her lungs with toxic fumes. A paper mitre was placed on her head, bearing the inscription, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater," so that even illiterate spectators could understand the nature of the charges. Her slow procession through the streets of Rouen gave the gathered crowd ample opportunity to see the condemned woman and grasp the cost of divine English authority. The crowd assembled in Rouen's old marketplace numbered around 5,000 people, making this one of the largest public executions in medieval France. The audience was carefully selected by English officials, who ensured the presence of mostly English supporters and French collaborators, hoping for a favorable reception of the event. Yet even among this curated crowd, many later admitted they were shaken by what they witnessed. As Joan was led to the pyre, she was accompanied by 2 monks assigned to provide spiritual support in her final moments. Brother Martin Ledevenu and Brother Ysant Bart de la Pierre were chosen for their piety and ability to lend religious dignity to the ceremony. However, both later stated they were deeply moved by Joan's courage and faith in her last moments, and their testimonies became crucial evidence in her later rehabilitation. Joan's binding to the stake was carried out with particular care to prevent her from escaping the flames or losing consciousness prematurely. Her arms were chained behind the wooden posts with heavy iron links that would not burn quickly or offer relief. Her feet rested on a small platform designed to collapse once the fire reached it, forcing Joan to hang from the chains as her support vanished. The final moments before ignition included one last attempt to extract a confession. Bishop Cachun, who had presided over her trial, approached the stake and offered her a final chance to renounce her claims and beg the church for mercy. Joan's response was clear and unwavering. She declared that her voices were from God, her mission divinely inspired, and that she would rather die than deny what she knew to be true. The fire was lit by the official executioner, Geoffroy Tirage, who later admitted it was the hardest execution of his life. The slowly burning wood immediately began to produce thick smoke, and the flames crept up Joan's legs and clothing. The specially designed pyre allowed her to remain conscious and speak for a length of time that witnesses described as agonizingly long. Joan's final words became the subject of numerous eyewitness accounts. The most consistent reports claim she repeatedly called out to Jesus, pleaded for mercy, and proclaimed her faith even as the flames engulfed her body. These cries were heard by the entire crowd and continued, according to several witnesses, for at least 10 minutes, though some claim much longer. The crowd's reaction to Joan's prolonged suffering was far from what English authorities had anticipated. Instead of celebrating the removal of a dangerous heretic, many spectators felt nausea and horror at the deliberate cruelty. Some began to cry, others turned away, unable to watch. Several English soldiers involved in the ceremony later reported nightmares and spiritual torment. When the flames reached the upper part of Joan's body and her voice faded, witnesses claimed to see a dove fly out of the fire, heading south towards France. Though it may have been a bird startled by the smoke and flames, many interpreted it as a sign of Joan's innocence and divine election. This episode became part of the legend surrounding her death and contributed to her eventual recognition as a saint. The execution, intended as a demonstration of English power and religious authority, became a martyrdom that inspired French resistance for generations. Her enemies succeeded in ending her life, but in doing so, they created something far more dangerous than a living woman. They forged an eternal symbol of defiance against oppression, one that outlived all who had sought her destruction. Immediately after Joan's execution, the complex and conflicting reactions of witnesses and participants revealed the true nature of what had occurred. English officials who had organized the ceremony publicly expressed satisfaction, declaring that justice had prevailed and the threat posed by Joan's influence had been eliminated. Nevertheless, private correspondence and later testimony suggest that many were deeply shaken by the manner of her death and its possible consequences. Geoffroy Tirage, the executioner responsible for lighting the pyre, was among the first to express doubts about what had occurred.
Just hours after carrying out his grim task, he was reportedly seen in a tavern, drinking heavily and muttering that he feared he had burned a saint. When questioned by companions, he insisted that Joan's behavior in her final moments had convinced him of her innocence and divine inspiration. This testimony from the executioner himself later became a key piece of evidence in efforts to rehabilitate Joan's reputation. Several English soldiers present at the execution reported experiences they described as supernatural phenomena in the days following Joan's death. Some claimed to have seen visions of the young woman they had helped kill, others heard voices calling for vengeance. Whether these were true supernatural events or psychological consequences of guilt and trauma, they contributed to a growing sense among English troops that Joan's death had been a terrible mistake. The immediate disposal of Joan's remains was carefully planned to prevent them from becoming objects of veneration. Yet even this process proved difficult for her executioners. Her heart, which according to witnesses remained untouched despite the raging flames, was retrieved from the ashes and thrown into the same river along with the rest of her remains. The very fact that special measures were required to fully destroy her body led many observers to believe there was something supernatural about Joan herself. News of Joan's execution spread rapidly across France, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and refugees who had witnessed the event or heard accounts from eyewitnesses. The reaction in French territories was immediate and intense. Instead of being cowed by a demonstration of English power, many French communities responded with heightened resistance and renewed determination to expel the occupiers. The propaganda value that English officials had hoped for turned out to be entirely reversed. Instead of proving that claims of divine inspiration were false and dangerous, her death convinced many French people that she had truly been chosen by God, and that her martyrdom confirmed the righteousness of their cause. Churches across France began holding memorial services for Joan. Despite the danger to participants, King Charles VII, who had done nothing to prevent Joan's execution, found himself in an awkward position, forced to respond to public outrage over her death. Though he cannot openly criticize the process without admitting his own failure to protect her, he began distancing himself from any suggestion that Joan had been justly condemned. This shift in royal posture eventually led to attempts at officially rehabilitating her name and revisiting the verdict. The English administration in France within months began to realize that Joan's death had become a strategic disaster. Instead of eliminating French resistance, it had given the movement a powerful symbol and rallying cry, far more effective than her living presence had ever been. Church figures involved in Joan's trial also began facing unexpected consequences. Many were criticized by their subordinates and congregants who questioned how men of God could have participated in such a process. Some, like Brother Martin Ledvenu, began working almost immediately toward Joan's rehabilitation, offering testimony about her piety and faith in her final moments. The execution that was meant to end Joan's influence instead transformed her from a military commander into something far more powerful, a martyr whose story would inspire resistance to oppression for centuries. Her enemy succeeded in killing her body, but unwittingly ensured that her spirit would live on in the hearts of all who face seemingly insurmountable hardship in the name of justice and freedom. 6 months after Joan's execution, the strategic situation in France began to shift dramatically in favor of Charles VII and the French resistance. The martyrdom that English officials had so carefully tried to prevent was becoming reality. Joan's death inspired a level of French unity and resolve that her living presence had never achieved, and the psychological impact of her execution proved far stronger than any of her military victories. The most visible consequence was the transformation in the morale and effectiveness of the French army. Soldiers who had previously hesitated to engage English forces now displayed a fierce determination that astonished their commanders. Many claimed they fought with the belief that Joan was watching over them, and that her sacrifice demanded justice against those who condemned her to death. This shift in combat spirit led to a series of French victories that overturned years of English success. Towns and villages that had once resigned themselves to English occupation began uprisings and resistance movements inspired by Joan's example. The realization that a peasant girl had dared to challenge the most powerful military force in Europe instilled faith that English rule was not inevitable. The local population, previously passive, began supplying intelligence and support to French forces, making it increasingly difficult for the English to hold territory. The diplomatic repercussions of Joan's execution also damaged England's interests. The cruelty of her death, combined with the questionable legal procedures that preceded it, alienated potential allies and strengthened France's position on the European diplomatic stage. Many rulers who had previously remained neutral began to view the English side as unjust, complicating the maintenance of alliances necessary for continued occupation. The economic cost of maintaining control in France rose sharply, as English forces faced intensified resistance and required larger garrisons. The resources spent on capturing, trying, and executing Joan proved a poor investment. As England's position in France deteriorated, military expenses increased, while tax revenues from occupied territories declined due to widespread resistance and economic disruption. Perhaps the most significant consequence was that Joan's death eliminated one of England's core arguments for its claims to French lands. The English had asserted that their conquest was sanctioned by God and that French resistance contradicted his will. Joan's martyrdom became a powerful refutation of these claims, suggesting instead that God favored France's independence and opposed English occupation. This shift in religious symbolism proved devastating to English propaganda. The speed with which France's fortunes changed after Joan's death surprised even those most convinced of her divine inspiration. The siege of Compiègne, where Joan had been captured, was successfully lifted within months of her execution. Other English strongholds began to fall one after another, as French forces gained confidence and momentum. Each victory was attributed to Joan's intercession, further reinforcing belief in her sanctity and the righteousness of the French cause. By 1435, just 4 years after Joan's execution, the alliance between England and Burgundy collapsed, largely due to the military and political shifts triggered by her martyrdom. The Treaty of Arras officially ended Burgundian support for English claims to French lands, leaving English forces isolated and outnumbered. This diplomatic revolution was directly linked to the consequences of Joan's death and the transformation it sparked in France's national consciousness. The English government in London began to realize that the execution, once deemed so necessary in 1431, had become one of the greatest strategic blunders in England's history. Instead of securing control over France, it guaranteed the near total loss of English territories on the continent. The young woman they killed to preserve their conquests became the instrument of their undoing. By 1450, less than 20 years after Joan's execution, English forces had been driven from nearly all of France, save for the port city of Calais. The 100 Years' War, which had seemed close to an English victory at the time of Joan's capture, ended in complete triumph for France. The martyrdom that English officials had tried so hard to prevent had indeed occurred, but instead of reinforcing their position, it ensured their final defeat. The long-term consequences of Joan's execution extended far beyond immediate military and political shifts. Her martyrdom gave rise to a powerful mythology that would shape French national identity for centuries, while also demonstrating the futility of trying to suppress popular movements through violence and judicial murder. The process of Joan's rehabilitation began almost immediately after her death, initially out of political necessity, but ultimately driven by genuine conviction in the injustice of her condemnation.
King Charles VII, who had taken no action to save Joan during her lifetime, came to realize that his own legitimacy was in question as long as the woman who had crowned him remained officially condemned as a heretic. This political calculation led to the first formal attempts to review the verdict of her trial. The rehabilitation process proved long and complex, involving a thorough investigation of the procedures used during Joan's original trial and testimony from hundreds of witnesses regarding her character and conduct. The findings revealed how her condemnation had been the result of political manipulation rather than genuine religious grounds.
Witness after witness affirmed her piety, honesty, and sincere faith, directly contradicting the accusations used to justify her execution. Joan's formal annulment came in 1456, 25 years after her death, when a papal court declared that her original trial had been conducted improperly and that the verdict was null and void. This legal rehabilitation cleared Joan of all charges of heresy and witchcraft, officially recognizing that her execution had been a judicial murder, not a legitimate religious punishment. The rehabilitation also led to the official condemnation of Bishop Cauchon and other officials involved in her sentencing. However, Joan's transformation from condemned heretic to recognized saint took much longer and reflected a shift in attitudes toward her legacy and growing recognition of her spiritual significance. The Catholic Church, which had officially sanctioned her execution, gradually came to acknowledge that a grave injustice had been committed and that Joan's claims of divine inspiration were genuine. This evolution culminated in her beatification in 1909 and canonization in 1920. Joan's elevation to sainthood became one of the most dramatic reversals in church history. The same institution that had condemned her to death now declared her blessed in heaven. Saint Joan of Arc became not only the patroness of France, but also a symbol of redemption and the ultimate triumph of truth over political calculation. Her canonization was a recognition that political pressure must never outweigh genuine religious conviction. Joan's influence on French national identity proved even more enduring than her military achievement. She became the embodiment of France's resistance to foreign domination and a symbol of the common people's ability to challenge established authority driven by sincere faith. Her story inspired countless later movements seeking to overthrow oppression and establish justice, both within France and around the world. The irony of her legacy is that her enemies' attempt to erase her memory through a brutal public execution instead ensured her immortality. A young woman who might have been forgotten as just another medieval commander became an eternal symbol of courage, faith, and resistance to tyranny. Her death, intended to intimidate her supporters, became a source of inspiration that outlived all who had sought her destruction. Modern historians recognize Joan of Arc as one of the most significant figures in medieval European history, not only for her military successes, but for her impact on concepts of nationalism, religious authority, and individual conscience. Her willingness to uphold her beliefs even in the face of death became a model of moral courage that continues to inspire those who confront seemingly insurmountable obstacles in the pursuit of justice and freedom. Joan's execution remains one of the most shocking examples in history of how political necessity can corrupt legal and religious institutions, driving them to participate in actions that violate their own foundational principles. The young woman who died in agony in Rouen marketplace achieved through martyrdom something far greater than she could have through continued military service. She became an eternal symbol of the human spirit, refusing to be crushed by oppression. The horrifying details of Joan's execution, deliberately prolonged suffering, calculated cruelty, public humiliation, were designed by her executioners as a demonstration of the futility of resisting power. Instead, they reveal the desperation of her enemies and the lengths to which powerful men will go to silence a voice that threatens their control. The extremity of the measures taken against a 19-year-old peasant girl showed how dangerous her simple message of resistance had become. Joan's transformation from condemned heretic to canonized saint represents one of the most complete historical rehabilitations of a person destroyed by the political and religious structures of her time. Her story stands as a powerful reminder that temporal power, no matter how overwhelming it may seem, can never permanently suppress truth or extinguish the human spirit. The judges who condemned her and the soldiers who carried out the sentence are remembered today only as participants in one of the greatest acts of injustice in history. Joan of Arc's legacy reaches far beyond her role in medieval French history, encompassing universal themes of courage, conviction, and the strength of ordinary people to alter the course of events. Her willingness to preserve her faith in the face of the most horrific death established a standard of moral bravery that continues to inspire people around the world. She proved that the most potent force in human affairs is not military might or political power, but the unwavering conviction of a single individual willing to die rather than betray their principles. The execution, intended to end her influence, instead ensured that her story would be told for centuries, inspiring countless people to stand against injustice and oppression. Her enemies succeeded in destroying her body, but in doing so created something far more powerful, a martyr whose example outlived empires and whose name remained in humanity's memory long after her executioners were forgotten. In trying to silence Joan, her killers gave her a voice that would echo through eternity. The marketplace in Rouen where Joan died became a site of pilgrimage and remembrance, visited annually by thousands who come to honor her memory and reflect on the cost of courage. The church, now standing beside the place of her execution, serves as a permanent reminder that those who die for truth and justice, no matter how alone they may be in their final moments, are never truly defeated. Joan's story continues, inspiring all who face insurmountable challenges in the name of what they believe is right. Her final cry, Jesus, echoed over the medieval square and became one of the most powerful testimonies in history to the triumph of faith over fear and spirit over flesh. In that moment of ultimate agony, Joan achieved something no military victory could have granted. She became immortal, transformed by the cruelty of her enemies into a symbol of hope that would inspire humanity as long as people struggle against oppression and injustice. The young peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints was indeed chosen for a divine mission, though perhaps not the one she initially understood. Her true purpose was not merely to drive the English from France, but to show through her life and death that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they act with courage and conviction. By burning Joan of Arc, her enemies ignited a flame that would never be extinguished, creating a beacon of hope that continues to shine through the centuries. The execution, intended as an act of intimidation, became a battle cry. The death meant to end the legend gave rise to an eternal symbol. Joan's terrible end was not a conclusion, but a beginning, a moment when a mortal woman became an immortal inspiration to all who dared to challenge tyranny and fight for what they believe is right.
Yet they unwittingly created something far more powerful, a martyr whose example would outlive empires and whose name would remain in humanity's memory long after her executioners were forgotten. In trying to silence Joan of Arc, her killers gave her a voice that would echo through eternity. The marketplace in Rouen, where Joan died, became a site of pilgrimage and remembrance, visited annually by thousands who come to honor her and reflect on the cost of courage. The church, now standing beside the place of her execution, serves as an eternal reminder that those who die for truth and justice, no matter how alone they may seem in their final moments, are never truly defeated. Joan's story continues to inspire all who face insurmountable challenges in the name of what they believe is right. Her final cry, Jesus, echoed over the medieval square and became one of the most powerful testimonies in history to the triumph of faith over fear, a spirit over flesh. In that moment of ultimate agony, Joan achieved something no military victory ever could. She became immortal, transformed by the cruelty of her enemies into a symbol of hope that will inspire humanity as long as people struggle against oppression and injustice. The young peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints was indeed chosen for a divine mission, though perhaps not the one she initially understood.
Her true purpose was not merely to drive the English from France, but to show through her life and death that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they act with courage and conviction. By burning Joan of Arc, her enemies ignited a flame that will never be extinguished, creating a beacon of hope that continues to shine through the centuries, inspiring all who seek to change the world through faith, bravery, and unwavering commitment to truth.